What's going on, everybody? Zombies here again, and today we're back with another Marble Snap video. So in this one we are taking a look at Jean Grey, the first non-season pass card of the season. This one's dropping in Series 5. Jean is a 3-cost, 3-power card with ongoing. Players must play their first card here each turn if possible. So very much trying to control the flow of the game where your opponents can play cards, though it will be controlling where you can play them too. However, if you can build your deck around that fact and your opponent can't, well, this seems pretty promising. So should you be picking up this card? Well, it's worth noting that the new update is due tomorrow with spotlight caches and all that good stuff. So I don't really think that most players should be spending 6k tokens on this, as it is a Series 5 card. I think if you've been saving boxes and you really want Jean, it's better to go through the new system to get her. However, if you don't have very many boxes, maybe tokens are your best bet. But ultimately, I think Jean is a powerful card. I think it's a very strong effect. There are a lot of different ways we can utilize this, and we're going to take a look at some really cool brewed up theory crafts from Safety Blade in a minute here. But I think right now, at least in the context of the meta, I think this card is actually going to struggle a little bit. Now, that could change. We could get balance adjustments tomorrow, but I think for the time being, with high Evo and the Kitty bounce decks being kind of the top decks of the format, I think it is unlikely Jean is going to be very effective against those decks, as they both have ways of kind of playing into the Jean lane without having to worry about it. Bounce can obviously just keep spamming Kitty Pryde there, and the Lockjaw deck usually has enough cheap stuff to where they can throw some stuff in there, or they could just commit to that being their Lockjaw lane, for example, and then play their cheap thing, play something else elsewhere. So while I do think it's a very strong card, I don't know if it's going to be strong right now in the context of the current metagame. Again, that could be subject to change. For all we know, there could be some changes tomorrow that make this card a bit more appealing, but I think in the current environment, I don't see this drastically shaking up the meta, even though it is a card I think is powerful and has a pretty interesting and fun to build around effect. So ultimately, this one's getting a wait and see from me. I think most people probably want to hold on to their tokens, especially 6k tokens. That's a bunch. You could use those to get more Series 4 cards, since we're going to be having more of those coming out on release. You can get 2 cards for the price of this 1 card. I do think Jean is the strongest card out of the July cards, so if you're just looking to get 1 card this month, maybe Jean is the way to go, as I don't think the other cards are quite as strong necessarily, but again, that could change depending on the metagame, balance changes, etc. But yeah, Jean, probably a wait and see for me. I'm going to grab it because, well, I'm going to create content with the card. I'm going to try it out. But I think unless you have a really, really large stockpile of tokens, you should probably wait and see how this one goes, especially relative to any changes that might happen in the patch. Starting out, we're going to look at some Surfer lists. I actually think that Surfer is a really interesting way to go right now. This first list, we can see very, very teched out to beat the bounce matchup. A lot of players have been having success with Invisible Woman. It's a card that has felt quite good against bounce, mainly with Killmonger, but also we can see Shadow King here. Shadow King can be pretty devastating against the bounce decks, especially if you manage to throw priority or just have it reveal at the end of the game with Invisible Woman. But he can neutralize some of their powerful threats, such as Kitty, Hitmonkey, Bishop, Angela, some of the things that go really, really tall, get a lot of power at the end of the game. You can just set them to 1 or to 0 with Shadow King. So kind of cool that Shadow King is actually seeing some use, and I think Jean does make a lot of sense in a Surfer lockdown style of deck. You can opt to play Jean, fill up the lane with Brood, and then deal with pumping it up later with things like Silver Surfer or the Killmonger Nova combo. And I really, really like Invisible Woman right now because bounce is probably the best deck there is, and we really can't throw priority against them very easily, so Invisible Woman helps us avoid that. And Goose is also a really solid 2-drop here, as aside from Sarah, our whole deck costs 3 or less, so not really a problem playing into the Goose lane, and it's good for making sure that your opponent can't slam a big threat in that lane on the final turn, Storm also really good with Goose because it further limits where the opponent can play cards. Also makes Juggernaut better as we have the Storm Juggernaut follow-up, which is always pretty good. But yeah, pretty well-rounded deck here. I do think that Sarah Surfer is pretty underrated, and Jean looks like a solid addition to it. If you're not as big of a fan of the Sarah direction though, you can actually just cut her out entirely and go with all 3 drops with the addition of a Luke Cage as a bit of tech for the high Evo stuff. As we already have some powerful tech tools against the other popular deck in Bounce, this gives us another powerful tech card to go alongside Goose to hopefully help deal with some of the things that the high Evo decks are doing right now. Then we have Guardians of Jean. So this is kind of cool. What goes well with Jean Grey? Well, Guardians of the Galaxy do. When you know your opponent's going to be playing there whenever they have to each turn, your Guardians get a whole lot better. So pretty interesting direction to go with this one. We're opting to just use a few of the Guardians, but I think we are pulling pretty much the best ones here in Rocket Raccoon, Star-Lord, and Gamora. Also acts as a lockdown deck with Professor X and Spider-Man to hopefully seal up a lane for us on turn 5 so we can close it out on turn 6. Jeff, I think you're going to see become even more popular with the addition of Jean Grey, as he is going to enable being able to fill up the Jean lane, but we can move him later on if we want, so that way we can not have to worry about playing around her effect, and we can also just choose to play him not in the Jean lane if that is preferable. Nightcrawler can work as a bit of a budget substitution, but definitely not nearly as good as Jeff. But in this one, we're running both of them anyways. I do think you're going to be a little bit weak to Killmonger in this one, but I guess that's just a risk we have to take to play some of these powerful 1-drops like Nebula, Kitty Pryde, Rocket Raccoon, etc. Then we have the Jean Evolutionary, so adding Jean to the high Evo lockdown list. This list has gotten a lot less popular after the nerf to Spider-Man, but I don't think there is really a great reason for it being less popular. I think it's still really powerful, though it does collect a little bit of collateral damage from the 1-drops getting killed by Killmonger, since that's around everywhere for Bounce. Nonetheless, Sunspot Nebula is still really, really powerful to where if your opponent can't remove them, they can snowball out of control and naturally mesh with our game plan of locking down lanes and floating energy for the Hulk. Then we have a Sarah Control deck. This one's really interesting because Sarah Control, I think, is a deck that a lot of people have forgotten about. It's not as popular in Conquest, mainly because Wave was really popular as anti-bounce tech. Wave's really good against Sarah, so a lot of people stopped playing Sarah. But I actually used Sarah to get my first Infinity Conquest done, and it still feels really, really good when you can dodge the counters. I think there's less Wave now than there was before, as people have realized it's not as effective of a bounce counter as many people thought it would be if the bounce player is decent at playing around it. So I really like this list here. Invisible Woman has been an all-star, much like I mentioned before, just being able to hide your Killmonger or Shang-Chi as well. So you don't have to worry about the opponent not having priority. You still get your effect off. It's just a very, very powerful thing, and especially when we aren't telegraphing it sometimes, where we'll play Invisible Woman for 1 on the final turn, so the opponent won't even be expecting to play around it. I think Jean is also interesting because by forcing your opponent to play into a certain lane, that can also help us with things like Shang-Chi, making it so we know exactly where the opponent is going to play their big thing on the final turn, if that's the line they go with. Next up, we have a pure ongoing focused list. This is pretty interesting. You know, we haven't seen too much of the ongoing decks in a while now. Ongoing Destroyer used to be way more popular back when the game first came out, but as things have changed, new cards are added, old ones are balanced, kind of fell out of favor a while ago, and this feels like a bit of a reincarnation of it. Instead of opting for a higher top end with the Destroyer and whatnot, we have Spectrum as the only thing we're going to be using, but we do have some powerful 5-drops in Iron Man and Professor X. Most of the cards in the deck have ongoing. Cosmo, I think, can be very, very strong alongside Jean, especially if you're running into decks that rely a lot on their on-reveal effects. Luckily, we don't really have to worry about that, and obviously Spectrum going to be a pretty powerful way to close out the game, given that the majority of our cards in the deck run ongoing. But yeah, this feels like we're just jamming most of the good ongoing cards in a deck. Cheaper Curve makes a lot of sense as it enables us to fill up that Jean lane.
So overall, if you're a fan of the ongoing archetype and you kind of miss that style of deck, maybe this one is worth considering. Another interesting direction you can go with the ongoing cards is with the Thanos deck. This one, it's a little bit more zoo style, as we have all the stones, which 2 of those have ongoing abilities. We're buffing them up with things like Khazar, Blue Marvel. Valkyrie can be a surprise way to close out a lane at the end of the game that the opponent expects they can win. Her and Shang-Chi are going to do a lot of work for dealing with the powerful threats the opponents have. Dazzler been doing pretty alright in decks that are good at filling the board. Armor provides us a bit of protection. Things like Ant-Man, Mojo, and our other buff effects like Khazar and Blue Marvel make it so we can win a Valkyrie lane if both lanes are full, and then Spectrum just gives us another decent way to close out the game, buffing up all of our various ongoing cards. And now we're venturing into the a bit more experimental side of things, but interesting nevertheless. Here we have a Living Tribunal deck. So it's a ramp deck. We're trying to ramp with our Electro, cheat out some big things. Basic idea with this deck is we're trying to just stack up one lane with the Living Tribunal, and Jean is pretty handy here as it forces the opponent to play into the one lane we're trying to stack, and hopefully we will win that lane, or even if we lose that lane after Tribunal, maybe Tribunal lets us win the other 2 lanes, which the opponent has been having a hard time playing into. At his release, the Tribunal wasn't overly impressive, and I'm not sure that this card is going to be enough to push him over the edge, but nonetheless, if it's a card you like playing around with and you want to try a new strategy with it, this could be worth considering. Next up, we have another kind of ongoing focus deck, but this one goes in a little bit of a different direction. The idea with this one is we have enough cheap cards where we can easily fill up our Jean Grey lane. Then we rely on some of our powerful 4-drops, things like Namor or Attuma, to hopefully just solo a lane on their own. Claw can also help out with that. Iron Man can help get us the Jean Grey lane, and Professor X, another good one that can just win a lane on its own, especially if the opponent is forced into the Jean lane. I definitely like this style of deck, and it would be really cool if it ends up working out, as I don't know if Namor has ever really seen much play. So it would be very cool if he and Attuma ended up working pretty well with Jean, and I definitely like the idea of what's going on here. Then we have a junk deck. So this is a pretty interesting one. Force your opponent to play into the Jean lane, then fill the lane up while we're ahead, so we can kind of just win that one easily. Have ways to kind of give the opponent negative power with things like donating our hood with Viper, Spider-Woman minusing power, Green Goblin. Just, you know, not many people are playing these junk decks anymore. And I think a big reason for that is the fact that Luke Cage became so popular when High Evo released, since there were so many mirror matches. But now that High Evo's been out for a while, you don't see as many people running Luke Cage anymore, so maybe it is the junk deck's time to shine, and maybe Jean Grey can help them get there. And then last but not least, we have a interesting Shuri deck. So I think the idea with this one is that we can use Shuri to pump something up, like our Vision or one of our 6-drops if we ramp with Electro, and then we can move the Vision around, or we can use Heimdall to move everything around. Just kind of keeps your opponent guessing, you know, between Heimdall, Zola, Orca, and Magneto. I feel like it's almost impossible to play around all the top end that this deck has on offer. And for that reason, you will probably take your opponent off guard with it quite a bit of the time. Will this be better than just a regular Shuri Red Skull deck? Hard to say, but if nothing else, it seems infinitely less predictable, and given that Shuri Red Skull usually folds pretty hard to Shang-Chi, that's probably a good thing, having it so your opponent doesn't really know what you're going to play or when you're going to play it going into the later turns of the game. And there we have it. That is going to wrap up our day 1 decks for Jean Grey. Again, highly suggest checking out the article, link in the description, from Safety Blade. Really like the brews he came up with here. Very excited to try some of them out tonight with Jean releasing. Again, just a friendly reminder that the new Spotlight cash system is set to launch tomorrow. So if you've been saving up your boxes and you want to get Jean Grey that way, definitely be sure to wait until you update your game and the new system is in place before you open those to try and get a chance at Jean. That's going to wrap it up for this video. If you enjoyed it, remember to like and subscribe, and stay tuned here at Marvel Snap Zone for all your Marvel Snap content. I'm Zombies, hope you enjoyed it, and I'll catch you in the next one. Peace.